Thick gray clouds enshrouded much of the northern side of the mountains. A chill wind cut deep into the flesh of every man in the party, save the slim, cowled figure in the thin, black travel cloak guiding the party. At this level, there were even traces of snow, and especially frost. The frost was very prevalent, giving the forest of firs through which they stalked a death-like sheen. 2 paces behind their guide, Lord Aldrich Jitten drew his own thickly furred cloak tighter. From under the hood of the rich brown and white garment, the red-haired noble narrow eyes, one deep brown and the other ice blue, darted back and forth along the landscape, seeking. His square jaw clenched in impatience.
"How much farther, sorcerer?"
he muttered, his words accompanied by dense white clouds.
"Not much farther at all, my lord,"
the black-clad figure calmly replied. Unlike the noble and the 5 burly men-at-arms, he strode along the uneven path as if on a pleasant afternoon hike. His voice was surprisingly deep for so thin and studious-sounding a figure, even deeper than Lord Jitten's. He glanced back at the broad-shouldered aristocrat, a man built much like the fighters who served him, revealing glimpses of a head with short-cropped gray hair and an angular face with matching eyes so narrow they made Aldrich seem round. The skin had a darker, slightly yellowish cast to it, almost as if the speaker suffered jaundice.
"In fact, I dare say, the first hints will soon manifest themselves." "I sense nothing." "Your skills are not as honed as mine are, my lord, but that shall be remedied soon enough, yes?"
Aldrich grunted.
"That's the point of all this, isn't it, sorcerer?"
The lead figure turned his gaze forward, leaving the noble only the back of his black hood at which to gaze.
"Yes, my lord."
They fell to silence again. Behind Aldrich, the 5 servants struggled under heavy packs. In addition to foodstuffs and blankets, they carried pickaxes, huge hammers, and shovels. Each man also wore a sword at his side. As desolate as the forest seemed, there were dangers, especially from night howlers. The huge beastmen were rare to find, not that most were so foolish as to go hunting for them, but when encountered had to be slain quickly. Night howlers thrived on meat, including human flesh. Legend said that they had always not been so monstrous, but no one in the Western Kingdoms cared about such legends. It was the blood-soaked facts that mattered. The only good night howler was a dead one. After all, as Lord Aldrich Jitten could attest, the dead ones at least made for fine, warm cloaks, like the one he wore. Several more minutes passed, and still the noble sensed nothing. He probed for some distance ahead, and only noted the continual emptiness of the mountainous lands. Even for this part of the southeastern Westmarch, the region was desolate. Not at all like the lowlands, where the lush, rich soil and pleasant rainfall made this part of the Western Kingdoms the envy of all other regions of the world. Even the thick fir forest through which they trudged felt sterile, more a ghost than a living thing. Lord Jitten grunted. And this had once been the heart of the ancient Westmarch? This had once been where the vast dominating estates of the sons of Rakkus had loomed over the first beguiling kingdoms of the land? The moldering parchments and crumbling stone slabs through which Aldrich had for months poured and spoken of a much warmer, much more regal land of huge city-sized estates, each of them run by one of the 5 lines descended from the legendary Paladin Lord. Few today knew the origins of King Rakkus, founder and first ruler of Westmarch, and most of those, Aldrich included, understood only that he had come from somewhere in the east, possibly even beyond the jungles of Kyrgyzstan. As one who believed himself descended from that very same lord, Aldrich thought this most definitely the case, and the explanation for the narrowness of his own eyes. What happened to the last of the Rakkus line was up to conjure, albeit by very few, since the legacy was all but forgotten in modern times. Lord Jin gathered from what little existed that, somewhere deep in the past, there had been a struggle for power between factions over an object of power. In fact, there had been more than one reference to it, and that had been what had first instigated him to search on. Yet until the chance encounter with his foreign companion ahead, the noble had found only dead ends. And dead ends were not something Aldrich needed. The dreams were growing worse with each night. They tortured and beguiled him at the same time. They hinted of enemies seeking his weakness, shadowy figures who had become so very real that Aldrich, despite never having clear faces or intelligible voices, each night the whispering phantoms drew closer to overtaking him, and each night the fear in him swelled greater. Often he woke full of sweat, certain that his screams had been heard throughout his estate. But those dreams had also given him the first clue, the one that had led him to the history of the Lord's Raucous and, finally, to this climb into the chill mountain region. Each time Aldrich had nearly taken by faceless horrific enemies, something had saved him. At first, it had been only an indistinct object, one that had appeared magically in his cupped palms. In progressive dreams, however, it had taken on form, gradually becoming a sphere, a huge pearl with odd yet familiar markings. At the same time, hints of the raucous ties to it had materialized. Old rotting banners with the house symbol still intact. Dank catacombs with the snarling wolf carved into the stone. And more. Most men would have simply thought themselves mad. But then, most men were not Lord Aldrich Jitton. Even before he had determined that within him coursed the blood of the sons of Raucous, Aldrich had known that he was of a select few. After all, he had been gifted with a touch of magic. His skills were slight, true, but in the dreams, they had grown, and when he had touched the gigantic pearl, that had, in fact, been the only reason his dream self had thus far survived. And if Lord Jin was to survive in the waking world, did it not make sense that he find what his subconscious kept steering him toward? Did not all his dreams and research mean to culminate in locating what the Eastern Devil called the Moon of the Spider? Aldrich stood as if suddenly as frozen as the trees around him. He glared ahead hopefully, but saw only more of the same bleakness.
Sorcerer!
The noble snapped.
What by the lords was that utterance for? There's nothing here!
His guide did not even look back.
Your senses are not attuned enough, my lord. You cannot see what there is to be seen, but I promise that it lies just before us.
One arm stretched back, the narrow yellowed hand gesturing Aldrich forward.
Step up, and I will show you a taste of what you desire to wield.
Lord Jin needed no encouragement. Driven by his demons, he battled his way up to where the slim figure awaited him. The 5 servants, much more encumbered, did their best to follow their master.
Where? Where, damn it?
All that stood before him were mounds of stone and ice in the same endless forest. The yellowed hand suddenly reached out and seized his own, squeezing with a strength that made Aldrich wince.
What?
And the Western aristocrat did. Everything was as it had been before, and yet now Aldrich saw distinctions that his sweeping glance had so quickly dismissed. The mounds of stone and ice had definition, if one only looked close. Definition that nature could have not created on its own. Lord Jin stared up the length of the mountainside and took in the full scope of what those definitions meant.
Can you sense it now?
Asked his companion, releasing his grip on the noble. Aldrich nodded. How could he miss it now? More to the point, how could he have not sensed it in the first place? The stronghold of the last of the sons of Raucous. Ahead lay what to the ignorant simply appeared a large, oval depression between 2 ridges. Of course, those ridges were much too uniform and, to Aldrich's now awakened senses, were the flanking walls of the entrance to a much larger structure, rising up several stories above. The Lords Raucous had built their massive estates into the very mountains, carving out the rock where needed, adapting it where it was not. Now Aldrich saw the steep city that they had built, each level once luxurious and spanning. There were small terraced villas and garden walkways, all draped by the culmination of centuries of weather. Higher up stood a tower from which the ruler himself would look down upon his realm. Aldrich squinted, noting that what had appeared to be an outcropping near the top was actually the thrusting arm of a great statue that might very well have been of Racchus himself. The noble grinned as he drank in the truth. Buried beneath the snow, ice, and stone was a structure to rival any of which he had seen or heard, especially in Westmarch. Behind him, the men-at-arms muttered excitingly among themselves. They no doubt thought of treasure. Aldrich paid them little mind. He already knew that anything of such base value had long been stripped away in the aftermath of the Lord's downfall. The riffraff would have to be satisfied with what he so generously paid them. But as for his own treasure quest, his eyes were drawn to the depression at the base of the sprawling ruins. Marching up to it, Lord Jitten confronted the layers of earth and ice he was now certain kept him from his goal. He turned back to his servants, snapping,
"Well, drop that gear and come dig."
They immediately set to work, rightfully fearful of their lord's wrath. As the clatter of picks and shovels echoed throughout the otherwise still region, Aldrich could not help feeling as if the clamor might somehow stir up the ancient rulers themselves. Curiously, he found himself more fascinated than uneasy. So little was known of them, and, as likely one of their last descendants, Aldrich felt their history was his. Had matters turned out differently, perhaps he would have now sat at that high tower, master of all Westmarch and beyond. Master of all. It occurred to the aristocrat then that perhaps it was even they who had reached out from the abyss of death to give him this key to his future. With it, all his enemies, known and otherwise, would be swept away before him. Then, a heavy-set, flaxen-haired servant wielding a pickaxe abruptly screamed. He and his weapon fell through a sudden collapse in the ice and rock, and a darkness like a hungering mouth swallowing him in an instant. The other workers leapt back rather than risk themselves in a vain attempt to save him. Lord Jitten reached the hole just in time to hear the fatal thud. He ignored the mishap, instead eagerly peering down into the darkness.
"A light! I need a light!" he ordered.
No sooner had he demanded it than suddenly a pale bone-white glow appeared next to him. It emanated from an object in the hooded figure's hand. The voluminous sleeves of the cloak obscured it from Aldrich's view, but all that mattered to the noble was now he had the means by which to see what lay within the mouth. Cracked stone steps turned on a rightward spiral for 2 floors. The hapless worker's broken body lay to the side of the bottom step, his pickaxe just to the edge of the illumination.
"Shall we descend, my lord?"
asked the shredded spellcaster. Lord Jitten answered by immediately doing so. The figure next to him chuckled, then followed after. The peculiar illumination wielded by Aldrich's guide cast an eerie presence over the stone chamber as the party descended. In it, savage lupine creatures seemed to leap out from the very walls themselves. More stone gargoyles following the wolf motive of the ancient lords. The heads of each were 3 times as large as that of a man, and the huge toothy jaws stood open, as if ready to seize any who dared step near. The sleek head stretched back to powerful shoulders. Even a pair of wicked paws thrust out beneath each head. The detail was so remarkable that Lord Jitten could make out the individual hairs on the heads. A sudden urge came to touch one, to see how it felt. But as he took a step closer to the nearest, a sense of foreboding filled him. With a frown, the noble immediately stepped away. His hooded companion moved on ahead, illuminating more of the long chamber. An intake of breath, the first break in the spellcaster's ever calm demeanor, immediately caught Aldrich's complete attention.
"Yes. What is?"
He got no further. 4 words escaped him then. A sarcophagus. It was tall and rounded, at least the height of a man, and 3 times that from front to back. It had been built from a substance Aldrich did not recognize. Not stone, for none that he had ever seen, not even the whitest marble, could compare with its sleek, gleaming finish. In fact, as the two drew closer, it shimmered in the pale light, almost as if alive. Pearl. That was what it reminded Aldrich of. Iridescent pearl. It was as if the thing before him had been created from a single, gigantic pearl. No matter where he looked, he could see no construction seam. There was something more curious, though. Aldrich Jitton studied the curvature, the curious markings that, the longer he stared at them, seemed to radiate with light of their own.
This is not the sons of Rachis. It should not be here.
The other shook his hooded head.
No, my lord. It is not of the Wolf Lords. Did you expect it to be? This is Vajari work, you see. And yes, it should be exactly here.
The noble waited for further explanation, but none was forthcoming. Unable to contain himself any longer, Aldrich inspected the sarcophagus more closely. As he did, he spied another marking higher up, one at the edge of the light.
Sorcerer!
His guide shifted, the light now sweeping across the symbol that Aldrich wanted to see. One of the servants gasped at the sight revealed. Stumbling back in surprise, he hesitated directly in front of the great wolf heads. With an ear-splitting roar, the head stretched forth, its mouth open wide. The jaws enveloped the man's head, clamping tight. It bit down. The headless body tumbled to the floor. Immediately, the stone wolf receded to its previous position, then stilled. Its jaws remained shut, but crimson dots now dotted the floor beneath. The remaining three tenants started retreating to the steps, but a fierce look from Lord Jitton drew them forward again. Satisfied of the control over him, he gazed once more and rapt attention at the symbol draping the upper part of the elaborate sarcophagus. Despite forces he could now feel emanating from within, Aldrich did not hesitate to bring his fingers up and trace along the vivid crimson outline that had so frightened his followers. A huge circle, and within it, the stylized shape of a menacing, eight-limbed creature. An arachnid.
The sign of the moon of the spider.
The noble whispered.
Did I not promise?
Asked the other. Lord Jitton began seeking some manner by which to open the sarcophagus, but his grasping fingers could still discover no crack, no handle.
Are we in time? We are.
The more his efforts proved for naught, the more frantic Aldrich's search became. He started banging his fists on the top, striking the spider emblem hard. Finally, he whirled on the servants.
Get open! Hurry!
With clear reluctance, they came forward with pickaxes.
My lord,
began the hooded spellcaster. Jitton did not listen. He pointed at the center of the arachnid.
There! Strike there!
As when the trio laid into the effort, striking with practiced efficiency. Once, twice, thrice, each tool bit into the top of the sarcophagus, almost always pinpointing the spider symbol perfectly, but not one of the strikes so much as marred the surface of the structure. The head of one pickaxe chopped off, flying through the chamber and clattering against the wall. At that point, Aldrich ordered the three men back.
Sorcerer? I have the means, yes.
An enraged Lord Jitton turned on his guide.
Then why did you let us waste precious time?
Rather than point out that he had attempted to tell the noble earlier, the spellcaster suggested,
Those three would make better use of themselves at the moment, lighting torches. We will need the fire's illumination in a moment.
A wave of Aldrich's hands set the servants to work. Within seconds, two of them wielding blazing torches. At that point, the outlander hid away the object he had used to first light up the tomb. Pushing back his hood, he surveyed with satisfaction the sarcophagus.
Make your choice, I await. What a tangled web we weave. Proceed.
One hand came up. In the palm, a tiny black crystal glittered.
As it is sacrifice.
Suddenly, the crystal sprouted tiny legs, 8 in all. To the astonishment of all save its master, it leapt from the palm, landing readily atop the symbol on the sarcophagus. Where the pickaxes had made not even the least penetration, the 8 limbs thrust with utmost ease into various parts of the lid surrounding the center of the crimson image. There was a brief hiss, and the rounded top slid back. Lord Aldrich Jitten did not question where his companion had procured the macabre key. All that mattered was that the way was open. Leaning, he eyed the contents. A long robe form lay stretched within. There was something amiss about it.
Bring the torches up. I can't see.
Aldrich commanded. In the fire, the occupant was revealed. Although he had already expected it not to be the remains of one of the Lord's rockets, the identity of the entombed figure still startled him.
It's one of their own. A Vajeri.
The Vajeri were sorcerers whose origin also lay in the east, but they were of a more worldly nature than Aldrich's companion. They had ambitions and desires, and in his life, Lord Jitten had paid some of them for nefarious services. Not all were of such dubious nature, but to Aldrich, the distinction between good and bad Vajeri was negligible. But why waste such an effort for the burial of one of their own in this of all places? Why make such a trek here in the first place? Skin still covered the bones of this ancient spellcaster, as did wisps of long gray beard and hair. The familiar orange-colored, wide-shouldered robes called the turanash, a style hardly changed after centuries, wrapped around the macerated body. Golden runes, supposedly designed to enhance the wearer's power and protect him from harm, lined the garment. A gold breastplate and belt gave some hint of past glory and riches, but such things were of no such interest to the noble. At the mummy's left side lay one of the rune-etched staves generally wielded by those of the order. In the gnarled, gaunt hands resting atop lay the object of Lord Jitten's quest. It was not as large as in his dreams, but it was no less spectacular. The size of an apple, maybe a bit more, but that was it. It resembled a pearl of lunar radiance. A perfectly round moon that somehow made the sarcophagus seem crude and dull. An entire city, nay, all of Westmarch, could surely have been bought with it. Had there been no more to the artifact appearance, perhaps Aldrich would have done just that, for then it would have been otherwise useless to him. As it was, though, even the clawed fingers of the dead Vajeri could not obscure the 8 ebony streaks perfectly crisscrossing the pearl. They were the reasons for its name. The reason he had sought this treasure out. They were the reason it was called the Moon of the Spider. Lord Jitten started to reach for it, but his shadowed companion prevented his hand from rising.
Taking from the dead is hardly the work of one of your station, my lord.
He suggested to Aldrich, his low tone hinting of something more than the properties of caste. Brow arched, Aldrich snapped his fingers at the nearest manservant.
Rolf, retrieve that for me.
Rolf grimaced, then bowed his head. Handing his torch to one of the others, he strode up to the sarcophagus. With a grunt, he reached 2 beefy hands toward his master's prize. His fingers grazed those of the cloaked cadaver. Rolf howled. A fiery aura spread forth from the Vajara's corpse to manservant, and then back again. The transformation took place in less than a blink of an eye. The very life essence was sucked from Rolf, as Lord Jitten might have sucked the juice from a piece of orange. The manservant's skin shriveled and his eyes sank into their sockets. His burly form melted into a wrinkled skeleton. He tried to the very end to pull free, but could not. As his dry corpse collapsed in a grisly heap upon the floor, the mummified Vajara sat up. His skin was still dry and cracked, but there was some flesh beneath it now. The ghoulish visage shifted, yellow teeth suddenly barred and the lids opening to reveal not eyes, but a sickly yellow pus. A sound arose from the empty throat, and in that same moment, Aldrich sensed powerful magical forces arising. Something surrounded by a pale glow flew from the direction of the noble spellcaster. Aldrich expected it to strike where the ghoul's heart had once been, but instead, it curved upward at the last, burying itself in the decayed figure's forehead. The cadaverous ghoul uttered a harsh gasp and crumpled back into the sarcophagus, his body turning to ash at the same time. The gray-haired man beside Aldrich quietly and calmly walked up to the dust-laden remains and easily pulled free what he had tossed at the ghoul. A dagger, but one that Lord Jitten knew that had not been carved from metal. It was white, but the white of ivory or bone. Even with the torches near, its pale illumination was still noticeable.
The path to your desires is now open, my lord.
Its wielder remarked, unwilling to wait any longer. Aldrich Jitten dared seize the moon of the spider from what fragments remained of the Vajara's fingers. No terrible spell seized him. No ghoul leapt up to suck his soul away. It was his. At last, it was his.
The first step,
remarked his gray companion.
Now we must prepare for the rest. You do recall that, do you not, my lord? I recall very well, Coripitus.
Aldrich murmured, using the other's name for the first time in days. He stroked the artifact as if it were a lever, tracing it as he had the sarcophagus, the lines from which it drew its name. Coripitus began removing his travel cloak. In the same calm, studious tone he ever used, he said,
Then, we must begin now. Time is of the essence.
And, as his cloak slipped to the floor, Coripitus' own garments were better revealed. Utter black, save for a curious trio of bands across the upper chest and another that stretched down the midsection. One shoulder also bore a jutting protective cover, which on close inspection an onlooker would have realized was the skull of a horned and fanged creature that could have never walked the mortal plane in life. It and the bands were all the same in color, bone white. Much of what the gray-eyed spellcaster wore resembled armor of a reptilian look, with ridges and scales. Despite that, when Coripitus moved, his garments flowed as if silk, and he made no sound whatsoever. His leather boots rose above the knee and melded perfectly with the rest of his armor. And, at his waist, he carried the dagger which had so readily slain the undead Vajara. It still glowed, pulsating, as if with a life of its own. The blade had a serpentine shape, coiling back and forth before ending in a pin-sharp point. Upon its hilt was the one symbol to mark Coripitus' identity with any certainty. An almost invisible image seared into the handle. It was the tiny icon of a serpentine creature over whom hung a pair of weighing scales. Though some might have readily recognized the beast as a dragon, Only the rare outsider would know why the scales were set so. The dragon was known as Tragao, he who is the fulcrum of the balance. Tragao was as near to a god as Caribitis had, as any of his kind had. Tragao who watched over the followers of Rathma, the necromancers. Two. The inn of the Black Ram was a flat-roofed stone building in the lower end of Westmarch, the city that saw its fair share of the suspicious and the unsavory. Paradoxically, that meant that the establishment also saw its fair share of the powerful and wealthy, both those who sought the dank environment to close questionable deals, and those who simply desired a thrill. There was some of each this particular evening, the various types seated at their booths and tables and murmuring over tankards of throat-scorching ale and half-burnt mutton. But whatever the reason for choosing the Black Ram this foggy eve, all without the exception found themselves turning for no reason that they understood toward its creaking door just as the great bells of the city struck the late hour. He was pale of skin, and had a narrow face better suited for a studious clerk than a mysterious figure shrouded in dark cloak and robes. His eyes were the most arresting feature, for they were distinctly curved and of a startling gray. From out under the hood of his cloak, a few strands of flat black hair hung over his forehead. The stranger was of slim build, but in the way that acrobats were. The newcomer's high leather boots made no sound on the aged planks as he strode toward an open booth. His cloak billowed as he walked, and in the flickering light of the boxy brass oil lamps above, tiny silver symbols sewn into the trim of the garment glittered, disappeared, then glittered to life again. In one corner opposite from the new figure, a young woman whose graceful beauty stood out like a beacon in the neighborhood of the Black Ram watched him most intently. With her sat two men, one a giant with the clear look of a bodyguard, and the other roughly her age, with enough similarity of features to be easily identified as related to the woman. He scowled in the stranger's direction, clearly repulsed by what he saw. The plump, blonde serving woman, who should have seen to the hooded figure's needs, refused to step from behind the waist-high wooden counter where the ales were poured from the barrels. The proprietor, a balding stout man of middle years, tugged on his lower lip, then wiped his hands and proceeded out himself. Under a heavy brow, he eyed his newest patron with far more respect than he generally gave to all but the most highborn. "Greetings, Master Hiram, I am, Master of the Black Ram. 'Tis an unusual honor it is to have one of yours here. Unusual, but not unheard of. Been one or two over the years." The seated figure nodded once. His voice was smooth, calm. "Yes, I would not imagine many have come to Westmarch. What can I bring you?" "The stew I smell will do. I would ask for water, but here I suspect it'd be healthier to drink the ale." Hiram grunted. "Aye, then that is all, unless you have a room for the night." The innkeeper swallowed. "Just one night?" "Yes." Sensing Hiram's hesitation, the figure reached a gloved hand to one of the pouches at his waist. As he brought it up, it clinked with the song of good coins. Much of the innkeeper's trepidation vanished. "Aye, for one night we can help you, Master Zayl. Just Zayl." Left alone again, Zayl surreptitiously surveyed the room. He had never been this far from home, and, despite his demeanor, was uneasy. It had not been his intention to leave the jungles of Kedgestan for the western kingdoms, but he had been drawn here by forces far stronger than himself. "Would that I could be like them," he thought, blithely ignorant of the troubles converging on us all. His journey had taken him to the kingdom of Westmarch and the capital city of the same name. Cautious questioning of locals, cautious because one of his calling ever risked the notice of the authorities, had garnered Zayl only hearsay, enough to keep him enticed, but not enough to explain to him why he had felt driven to come to this particular region. He noted the woman across the room still eyeing him whenever she thought him unaware. From the glances and murmurs that passed between her and the smaller male, a sibling, Zayl suspected, they knew him for what he was. A follower of Rathma, a devotee to maintaining of the balance, a delver into the world of the dead. Many shunned necromancers, not without good reason sometimes, but those like Zayl who had given themselves over to the teachings of Rathma meant people no harm. Zayl's kind fought against the darkness, against the primevals, for victory by the forces of hell would forever send the balance completely awry. The Rathmanians' methods might not always meet with the approval of the uninitiated masses, but the results were what counted, when terrible defeat could mean the end of all. Each necromancer was taught to follow the course of the ongoing struggle on his own, choosing his path on the basis of where his senses dictated he had to go. It had come as a great shock to Zayl when he felt himself compelled to journey west across the Twin Seas. But he had not shirked from his duty. The balance was in too precarious a state to turn a blind eye from what needed to be done. After all, the World Stone had been destroyed. His dark reverie was interrupted by the return of Hiram with his meal. The stew, a greenish-brown mass with bits of old vegetables and stringy meat in it, had a tolerable odor and taste, and the ale looked fresh enough. Having expected worse, Zayl nodded his approval. He was nearly hungry enough to devour the table, though he would have never visibly revealed such weakness even to himself. Rathmanians learned to fast for extended periods of time in order to purge their bodies of impurities, but Zayl had gone longer than normal. Even this questionable fare would go far in restoring him to his full faculties. Paying the proprietor, the necromancer took off his left glove, picked up the iron spoon resting in the bowl, and began to eat. The right hand remained covered, even despite the growing warmth of the room. As he reached for his drink, a muffled sound emanated from the large pouch. Zayl's gloved hand immediately slipped to the pouch, slapping it once. The sound cut off. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked to see if anyone had noticed. Only the woman appeared to have noticed anything unusual, but instead of being disturbed by it, she was now speaking more animatedly with the young male. He in turn shrugged and said something clearly derogatory about Zayl. The necromancer turned his attention back to his meal and thoughts. In truth, he could not actually be certain that the World Stone had been destroyed, but the evidence was certainly there. Mount Ariat, where legend claimed it had been hidden, had exploded, its entire top ravaged. The destruction had been heard about even here in faraway Westmarch. More to the point, the rumors among those with the site gave stalker credits to the horrific claim. It was said that one of the primevals themselves, BEAU, Lord of Destruction, had been the cause, and if so, the mortal plane was in far worse to come. The World Stone had existed since time immemorial, created, so the teachings of Rathma said, to keep the mortal world protected. Now both the powers of light and darkness reached out to fully claim humanity, and in their battles against one another, the two cosmic factions threatened to destroy what they desired. Somehow all that tied into Zayl's own urge to come to Westmarch. Somewhere in this vast kingdom, the repercussions of BEAU's heinous deed would soon be felt. The only trouble was, he had no idea what to do next. Arriving in Westmarch was far as his sense of urgency had brought him. Now, Zayl felt adrift, confused. If you cannot find the way, wait. The way will find you. Rathma himself had supposedly said that, and from past experience, Zayl had found it to be all true statement. Yet despite his extensive training, he was finally growing impatient. If the balance, and therefore all else, was in jeopardy, it behooved the way to find him, and quickly. He smelled before he saw the man suddenly standing beside his booth. The whiskered and capped figure looked as if he had been to sea much of his life, and from the scars and missing finger, a good part of that had probably been as a privateer. The mariner leaned over the table, obscuring Zayl's view of all else, and looked the Rathmanian up and down.
Friend of mine says that you be a necromancer.
He is correct. Zayl quickly returned, hoping that would end the conversation then and there. Alas, such was not to be true. Bending so near, his breath came at the spellcaster in smothering waves. The Westerner continued.
So these marks on your cloak.
He seized a portion near Zayl's shoulder, pulled it up between them. Seen close, the symbols almost danced.
They're all about death, aren't they?
They are about aspects of the mortality of life, that which follows after
Death.
among other things. The necromancer had no wish to draw more attention to himself, but he could see this conversation coming to no good end. What intention did the man have?
Get your grubby fingers out of my eye!
Bellowed a voice all too familiar to him. From somewhere behind Zayl there was a gasp and a curse. They were followed by a thud, and the same voice shouting,
Damn! Can't stop myself! Zayl! Zayl, lad!
The man who had been speaking with the necromancer suddenly grabbed for Zayl's throat. Zayl moved faster. The heel of his left hand bared into the villain's jaw, throwing the latter back. At the same time, the necromancer muttered a few words under his breath. The scarred mariner looked around the room in absolute panic. He pointed at an empty corner and gibbered,
By the twinsies! What is this beast?
His gaze shifted left.
Another! Demons! There's demons everywhere!
Screaming, he shoved past his partner in crime, a stocky bearded figure holding a dagger in one hand. The second mariner's other hand was still half clenched. Zayl quickly glanced down at his waist. While he had been distracted by the first man, the companion had cut free the larger pouch without his sensing it. Of course, that had been the worst mistake they could have made. The second thief blatantly noticed Zayl rising. He started to lunge, but the spellcaster muttered another word. The blade went completely past Zayl. His attacker stumbled, then gasped. He began frantically waving both hands about.
My eyes! I can't see! My eyes!
The effect was a temporary one, just like the spell that had made the first brigand think that he was surrounded by demonic creatures. Zayl started to reach for the blinded villain.
Look out!
Called a female voice. He ducked back just in time to avoid the curved edge of a sword across the midsection. A wiry figure who was clearly in league with their pair grinned as he slashed again at Zayl. The necromancer reached to his waist and removed a small dagger. His adversary laughed, for although the spellcaster's dagger was a curious one, being serpentine of shape in the blade and carved with what appeared ivory, it hardly matched the length of the villain's sword. But when the cutthroat attempted to get past Zayl's guard, the dagger was there, meeting the longer blade and deflecting it with ease. Twice more the attacker lunged, only to be foiled. Zayl then pressed. He easily came under the other's guard, his dagger cutting the brigand in the arm and the chest. The necromancer's foe began to retreat, only to stumble over the purloined pouch.
Watch where you're stepping!
Complained a voice that seemed to come from within it. The would-be thief collided with the door in desperation. He flung his sword at Zayl, then leapt away. He seized the arm of his still blind comrade, then both men fled through the door. Zayl had no intention of giving chase. He thrust the dagger into his belt, then quickly retrieved the pouch. An epithet started to escape it, but a quick tap by the necromancer brought silence. Of the other patrons, most had fled at some point in the struggle. The few who remained seated eyed him for the most part with trepidation, loathing, and not a little fear. Zayl found it of interest that the woman and her bodyguard were standing as if having been prepared to give assistance. They were, in fact, the only ones who did not now treat him as a pariah. The Rathmanian recalled the warning cry and knew that it had been the noble woman who had given it. He bowed his head slightly in her direction, noting how she appraised him even now. Turning back to the booth, Zayl found Hiram anxiously coming over to him. The necromancer easily read the innkeeper's expression, for it was one that he had seen far too often. "I will be leaving," Zayl informed his host before Hiram could get up the nerve to ask him to do so. "I will not be needing a room, either." The proprietor could not hide his relief. "'Tis not me, master, but the others. They don't understand." Shrugging off Hiram's attempt at explanation, the black-clad figure retrieved his one glove from the table. Putting it back on, he tossed some coins to the innkeeper. "This will suffice, I think." The stout man eyed what lay in his palm. "More than enough, master. I can't in good faith." "Do not trouble yourself." Zayl was not wealthy, not at all, but as this had been his first stop in the capital, he wanted to leave with some semblance of respect from the locals, even after such chaos. A lost cause, surely, but he felt that he had to try. With the same silent stride with which he had entered, the necromancer headed out of the Black Ram. Zayl had no notion as where he would spend the night, but if necessary, he would do so out in the wild. He was used to doing so in the jungles of Kyrgyzstan, and so this would be no different, albeit cooler. His training had taught him to ignore most differences in temperature, and fortunately, the weather here was not that chill anyway. The mists had thickened since his entrance. Zayl focused, trying to see with more than simply his eyes. "Damn brutes," grumbled a voice at his side. "Be quiet, Humbart." "You weren't the one rolling helplessly over the floor, and without so much as a single drink beforehand." Zayl tapped the pouch. "No. I had only a sword against which to contend." "And you're welcome for my help there, lad. What would you do without me?" The pale figure permitted himself a brief smile, but otherwise did not answer. Then he sensed another presence nearing. In a whisper, he commanded, "Silence." "Are you just..." But another tap by the necromancer on the pouch finally quieted his unseen companion. Reaching out with his heightened senses, Zayl located the newcomer behind him. With one gloved hand near the hilt of his dagger, he continued along as if unaware. Heavy thuds signaled the other's approaching steps. Stealth was clearly not a strong suit of the one following him. When he felt that his pursuer had gotten close enough, Zayl spun around. In the necromancer's hand, the pale blade stood ready. The shadowed form of a giant met his gaze. Something about it struck Zayl as familiar, and when he looked closer, he recognized the man. It was the bodyguard of the noble woman who had given Zayl warning. The giant's hair was shorn close, stubble peppered across the dark skin of his face. He stood with the stance of a well-trained fighter, in that manner reminding the necromancer of Captain Kentrell Dumont, a mercenary whose path Zayl had crossed and whom he respected highly. The bodyguard was clad in dark blue livery with crimson edging on his sleeves and pant legs. An emblem, a red circle surrounding a blue hawk's head, had been sewn on the uniform just where the heart was located. One of those unfortunate traditions that often gave enemies a perfect point upon which to target their weapons. The broad-rimmed boots seemed a bit garish to the Rathmanian, but he would have never been foolish enough to say so to such a mountain of a man.
I come at the behest of the mistress,
rumbled the bodyguard, showing both hands empty. He had an accent that marked him as coming from near to Luca Lane, on the western edge of the Twin Seas, and a place through which Zayl had passed on his way to the Western Kingdoms.
She would seek your counsel, Rathmanian, in a matter of the soul.
Would not a Zakarum priest be more appropriate than I? The giant grinned. And even in the misty dark, Zayl could see his white teeth, his many white teeth.
Zakarum, they would not appreciate the mistress's intent.
The fact that she had asked the necromancer to come to her made that clear enough. But Zayl was not ready to simply acquiesce. And what would she wish of one of mine?
She must speak with her husband, the matter with urgency.
And if the woman needed Zayl, it was because her husband was dead. An inheritance, no doubt. There were those who thought that the Rathmanians no better than the charlatans who read fortunes or gave seances at fairs or on the roads, paid performers, even if some of them had the gift. He started to turn away, but the bodyguard would not have it, and then reached for Zayl's arm, unaware of the danger of doing so.
She has nowhere else to turn. She said that something drew her in the inn, and when she saw you, she felt certain that you were the reason.
The necromancer hesitated. The last was likely a lie, but her suggestion that she had been drawn to the same location as him made Zayl think again of Rathma's words. Was the way being shown to him now? He balanced the pros and cons of agreeing, and found the cons slightly stronger. Yet, when Zayl opened his mouth to speak, it was to answer, "Very well. I will see her."
Thank you.
The bodyguard's tone hinted of tremendous relief, something that Zayl had not expected from a hired fighter from an employer. Most would have simply accepted the response. Zayl read in this man a deep loyalty. His large companion led the necromancer through the mist-enshrouded streets. Despite his agreement to see the noblewoman, Zayl remained cautious. This could still be a trap set by thieves or even the Zakarum. But if a trap, it appeared an elaborate one. Some blocks from the Black Ram, Zayl and his still unnamed companion confronted an elegant coach pulled by 4 muscular white horses. A dour driver, in the same livery as the bodyguard, nodded to the giant. Zayl noted that the house insignia was not at all obscure. Contrast to the age-long practice of aristocrats out on such ventures. The bodyguard moved ahead to open the door of the coach. As he did, someone within leaned toward the opening. Zayl faltered slightly. Her skin was a shade darker than his own, her full lips a deep, rich coloring that he knew was not the result of any enhancement. The hair cascaded down past her shoulders, ending below her shoulders. He had no doubt that her face and form attracted many a man, but she was clearly one who did not in any manner use her gifts for influence or gain. Certainly not with a foul necromancer especially. The noblewoman eyed Zayl closely, then glanced at her companion.
Thank you, both.
The giant bowed.
Mistress.
She extended a slim hand toward the Rathmanian.
Please, enter.
I would first know a name, my lady. A true name. Before she could answer, a male voice from within the coach snarled, "By the stars, Selene! I told you that this is going too far. Tell him nothing and let's be gone from this sneaking area. I've known much better places to get drunk than that flea trap we were just in." Zayl recalled the man in the black ram that had assumed was her brother. So far, there seemed little similarity in their personalities. That he had already given away her first name while insisting she tell him nothing said much.
Hasarda.
She returned quietly, smiling at Zayl as if aware of what he thought about her brash companion.
What he asks is fair, if he's to assist me.
You can't trust his kind. The Church of Zakharum says he's a desecrator of graves. A ghoul. Selene's smile hardened, and the gaze she turned on the unseen Sardak immediately silenced him. When she looked again at Zayl, it was with honest apology.
My brother is protective of me, Rathmanian, as I am of him, Master.
I am just Zayl, my lady.
Nothing more? Well, just Zayl. I am the Lady Selene Nesardo, and if that is enough introduction, I prefer that we leave here now.
She retreated into the coach, her invitation for him to sit beside her obvious. Zayl's brow arched. Few women there were who would have willingly have offered that. Even for the summoning of a rich husband's spirit, he had expected her to insist he sit next to the charming Sardak. A muffled snort escaped the pouch. Wolf frowned, but when the noise did not repeat itself, he relaxed again. Still holding the door, he said,
Master Zayl?
Bowing his head slightly to the bodyguard, Zayl slipped up into the coach with the quiet ease of a shadow. His vision more attuned to the night than that of most people, Zayl saw the sour expression on the brother's face. However, despite Sardak's threatening attitude, Zayl calculated that the man was little danger to him. Drink was Sardak's only weapon, which he used against himself. In that brief moment during which her brother had captured the necromancer's attention, Lady Selene Nesardo had fully recovered her wits. She glanced at the large pouch.
The couch is small. I can have the pulse. Put that in the storage box in the back if you'd like. You might be more comfortable than in.
Quickly sliding a hand atop the bag, Zayl replied, It stays with me. She had obviously seen the movement of his hand, but said nothing of it.
Yes, I saw her list these not lessons in their dismay.
Lady Nesardo said no more about the pouch, not even inviting any curiosity as to what it held. That despite having no doubt heard the voice in the end, she would find out soon enough the truth if Zayl agreed to what she requested. Sardak remained grimly silent throughout the ride, staring at the necromancer as if Zayl had grown fangs and the pair of horns. Zayl had expected his hostess to begin explaining her needs, but when she spoke it was only to ask him such mundane questions like how his journey across the Twin Seas had gone and what Luco Lane was like. Selene did not ask why he had traveled so far, though. The noblewoman did her utmost to treat him with a respect due to another of her station, as one who was generally looked upon with disdain, distrust, or fear. All feelings embodied in her brother at the moment. Zayl found it refreshing. Then, without warning, a black wave washed over him, overwhelming his senses. It was too much even for his training. A gasp escaped Zayel's lips, and the cloaked figure suddenly sprawled against the back of the seat. The interior of the coach vanished. The necromancer was caught in the bottomless black vortex. He felt bony fingers clawing at his flesh and heard the wailing of thousands of lost souls. The fingers tore relentlessly at him, resurrecting another horrible time that made the Rothmanian's gloved right hand clench tight. Suddenly Zayl became trapped in a sticky substance that he could not see. It was everywhere, and even his slightest struggles entangled him further. The wailing grew more strident. He heard the sounds of battle and the cries of death. Magical forces sprung into play around him. Then something else occurred. It reached out from death beyond, from a place far worse. Even though it was so very distant, he could sense its awful malevolence. But at that very moment, another presence entered its struggling place. Who or what it was, Zayl could not say, only that it sought to drag him forth from what assailed him. He seized the lifeline it offered, and finally managed to focus his will. The necromancer's mind tore free of the stickiness trapping it. The clawing hands and the mournful voices receded, and with them foiled, the dark presence sank back into the foul place from which it had emerged, and the mortal world began to come into focus. The first thing that Zayl saw was Lady Selene Nesardo's shadowed face looming over him. Her expression was filled only with concern. She had one cool hand against his temple. He realized that then she had been the source of his lifeline. The noble woman had some gift of magic herself.
Are you that, sir?
She muttered, her other hand thrust toward her brother.
Give me your flask.
Selene?
The flask.
A moment later, she brought a small silver drinking flask to Zayel's lips. The disciplines of the Rothmanians did not preclude drink, but still the liquid that slipped down Zayel's throat burned like fire. The necromancer coughed violently. Through his struggles, he heard Sardak chuckle. Can handle the dead, but can't handle his liquor. Selene glared at him.
Considering what you pour into your system, be thankful that I'm not having to ask him to summon your spirit.
At least my spirit would be full of spirits. Zayl ignored their argument, clearly an ongoing one of no relevance to the stunning attack on him. He shifted back to the proper sitting position, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. Calm, he might have seemed, but inside the necromancer was still feeling the effects of the earlier strain. It had taken him completely by surprise, catching him with most of his defenses down. From where it had originated, he sensed nothing upon his arrival in Westmarch, nothing even at the Black Ram. How could such a powerful force be localized? Is there not? The coach came to an abrupt halt. The Lady Nesardo quickly glanced out the window.
Right here.
The noblewoman declared, utterly ignoring Zayel's question. Home, sweet home, added Sardak with some mockery. Polth appeared at his mistress's door. He swung it open, then gave the Lady Nesardo a hand down. Sardak, moving with astonishing grace for one of his inebriated condition, slipped out right after her without so much as a glance back at the necromancer. From without the coach, Selene commanded.
Help our friend, Paul.
Without batting an eye, the bodyguard held out his huge hand to the Rothmanian.
Master Zayl?
Thank you, but I am recovered enough. Keeping his pouch near his side, he stepped out. While he had been recouping his strength, the coach had apparently not only arrived at the gates of its destination, but had entered them. A huge brick wall with spikes atop surrounded a wide manicured lawn. Zayl saw that the vehicle had driven up a stone path that wound from the iron gates to the front steps. Welcome to our humble abode, jested Selene's brother, stretching his arm toward the house. Zayl looked up, and farther up yet. In the midst of so many tall arched buildings with jutting towers and gargoyles atop the battlements, the house of Nesardo stood unique. It loomed higher than any of its neighbors, but where their towers ended in tiled, weathered points, it did so with a pale, moon-like roundness that seemed so pristine, even in the dark of night, that Zayl first thought it a new addition. But a cursory study of the structure as a whole immediately put that notion to rest. There were no breaks between the sections, as was always evident even with the most intricate reconstruction. This was the house as it had been originally designed. Zayl gaze moved on from the peculiar rounded roof. The sleek walls of the tower descended to a more typical rectangular design, which stretched out nearly twice as wide as the largest demicule. The roof of the main section arched so sharply and narrowly that it gave Selene's residence the feel of a cathedral or church, a complete contrast to the top of the tower. There were 8 windows on each level, and each of those windows was shaped like an octagon. 8 fluted columns also stood guard at the entrance, which consisted of a pair of massive iron doors, each with 8 bracketed frames decorating the front. To reach the doors, visitors would first have to ascend an equal number of lengthy marble stairs wide enough to hold several dozen people at once. At most any other time, such an obsession with a particular number would have struck Zayl with much interest, for the teachings of Rathma included understanding the influences of all numbers on the balance. There were numbers who could tilt it one way or another with ease, if manipulated by the knowing soul. But for the moment Zayl did not pay that any mind, for he was struck instead by something more immediate, something most unsettling. The building before him housed not only the Nesardo family, but also the source of which had nearly taken him on the coach. 3. Zayl gave no hint of his discovery as he followed Selene Nesardo and her brother inside. Once more, the words of Rathma returned to him.
If you cannot find the way, wait, and the way will find you.
But what yet did it all mean? How was this bound to the destruction of the World Stone? The halls of the Nesardo house stood high and were filled with shadows created by an array of round-bottomed oil lamps standing guard in braces on each wall. Their sheer number alone meant that there had to be more servants than the pair had thus far seen, but none were in sight, nor did he hear any movement beyond that of his own party. Concentrating, he sensed the presence of several others around him, all moving with a wariness that the necromancer deemed caused by him. As he proceeded through the long, oddly empty corridors, Zayl realized that everything here had been built larger than it needed to have been. Again, he felt more as if he entered a vast temple than a home. The necromancer did not even have to reach out with his heightened senses to understand that Selene's residence was also far more ancient than he would have expected. In fact, from what he had seen of Westmarch, it had to be older than nearly every other structure in the capital.
The House of Nesardo is one of the oldest in all of Westmarch.
His hostess informed him without warning. Had she read his thoughts? Ignorant of Zayl's brief suspicious glance, she went on.
The original structure was said to be part of the fortress, first raised by the great Lord Rakis.
The name registered with Zayl, but what he knew of the legend surrounding the man did not set with what he sensed of this place. Whatever its present occupants might think, there was something much older here, something as old as any ruin in the jungles of Kejan.
We will be most comfortable in here,
Selene added a few seconds later, gesturing at a sitting room large enough to hold more Rathmanians than Zayl himself had ever met. A wide fireplace, whose opening had been carved to resemble the maw of a huge wolf, greeted him with gutted flame. The huge fire looked to have been kindled, although again there was no servant about. "They heard you were coming," Sardeg blithely remarked. showing that he, too, seemed to be able to read Zayl's thoughts now and then. They were just dying not to meet you.
Forgive my brother.
Lady Nesardo interjected, smiling warmly at the necromancer.
He's concerned for my welfare.
And why not? That bastard thinks that he can take what is yours through deceit, and he has the influence to make the magistrate's decree such lies lawful? Her smile faded.
Yes, that's quite possible.
Zayl decided that it was time to take the reins. He already had too many questions concerning the house itself, and knew that they would never be answered if he continued to react, not act. After all, while Rothman preached that there were times to wait, he also preached that hesitation was the first step to defeat. You wished of me some assistance? The necromancer uttered, drawing the veiled eyes of both siblings. Being what I am, and having heard what I have, I can make some very accurate assumptions. However, before I promise my efforts, I must hear the absolute truth, and I will know if it is not. The last was in some part false, but the reputation of his kind made many believe such powers to exist. It often enabled the necromancers to better determine their course of action.
Yes, we delay too long.
The noblewoman indicated 3 plush, leather-clad chairs set near the fireplace. Sardak immediately dropped down in the one nearest the flames and reached for a smoked glass decanter set atop a crested golden tray on a small, square oak table. Although there were 3 matching goblets beside the decanter, the brother started putting the edge of the container to his lips.
Sardak, remember yourself.
With a grunt, he replaced the decanter. My apologies, dear sister. Selene nodded her satisfaction. She moved to see herself. Pulth, ever the silent shadow, holding her chair for her.
Thank you, Pulth. You may go now.
Mistress?
I have the utmost faith in Master Zayl's integrity, Pulth. You are dismissed.
The bodyguard bowed to her. To Sardak and even the necromancer, however his gaze came up, Zayl read in them a warning should anything befall his employer. But when Pulth had shut the doors behind him, Selene's gestured at the 3rd chair.
Please, sit down, Master Zayl.
Thank you. I prefer to stand. And it's just Zayl.
Will you at least have something to drink?
Zayl shook his head. My only interest is in hearing your tale, Lady Nesardo.
I will tell it then. But if you continue to be just Zayl, then you will from this point on refer to me as Selene, not Lady Nesardo.
And I, announced Sardak with a flourish and a mocking grin. You may not refer to me at all, necromancer. Ignoring him, Zayl looked into his hostess's eyes. They were of a startling green, one that reminded him of the lush plants of the jungles. They had a strength to them. She had a look about to her, too, that she could trace in part of her background and ancestry, not that far flung from his own. You were saying, my lady? Her brother snickered. She pursed her lips, but did not correct Sardak again.
This is the house of Nesardo. An old house, as I said. Unfortunately, it is a dying house, Zayl. You see before you the last survivors of the bloodline.
Sardak raised his goblet. Here's to an overdue end of a bad thing. Zayl frowned, something suddenly occurring to him. You are the Lady Nesardo, but your husband was also...
His name is Rioradan. My third cousin, once removed, but bearing the same surname, yes. A necessary match by our parents. We had never met, and it combined what remained of the Nesardo finances, making them stronger.
Selene shook her head.
It did not do the same, I regret, for our union. We had mutual respect, and even some affection. Still, that would not have been enough if any child had come of it.
She had barely been of age when they had married. Rioradan, a bull of a man in body, was a gentle soul by nature. He sought for the good in every man, sometimes searching for it too long. More than once he was cheated, although never by any drastic measure.
We were wed 3 years and a quarter when illness took him. No one could do anything to slow it. He might as well have been struck down by a sword. Rioradan was dead in 2 days.
With his passing, the weight of Nesardo's fortunes fell to the young widow, and she proved to be far more competent in managing its resources than her good-willed husband. In the 3 years that followed, she rebuilt what had been lost to the point that she felt that she could at least breathe safely. And then had come Lord Nesardo.
My husband knew him, did business with him. But once Rioradan passed away, I heard nothing from Lord Nesardo. Nothing, until he came to my door just a month ago, holding in his hands what he said was proof that Nesardo was now his.
The documentation appeared authentic. A turning over of the estate in lieu of money borrowed from Lord Nesardo for an enterprise, the noble said, had not proven out for Nesardo. Selene had recognized her husband's signature and seal, but the scope of what he had promised the other noble stunned her. She could not believe Rioradan that naive. In reply to her demand as why he had waited 3 years to bring this dire news to her, Lord Nesardo had spoken pretty words about giving the widow time to grieve, but Selene had sensed that there was something more to it. Unfortunately, she could not read him as she could others. At this point in her story, the Lady Nesardo took the goblet her brother suddenly proffered her. Her expression had grown more strained since she'd first begun the tale, but in her Zayl noted no guile. Thus far, what he'd heard appeared to be the truth. How long have you known of your gift? He asked the moment Selene finished sipping. She did not try to avert the subject this time. Her steady gaze meeting his, Selene nodded, answering.
It began to manifest when I reached adulthood. I've kept it quelled much of the time since. It's not considered a comely trait for a woman in my station.
It is unschooled, then. She nodded.
Yes, although some aspects of it I understand better than others.
The necromancer recalled how she had come to his aid. In the coach, you sensed what happened to me. You knew I was under attack, and by something involving this house.
Yes. I've never seen it act against anyone, though, or else I wouldn't have risked bringing you. I almost demanded that you leave for your own sake.
Which I would have refused at that point. I do not like leaving such mysteries unanswered. He considered something. You lived in this place before your husband Rioradan Nesardo was the newcomer to it. Not you.
I was born here.
Zayl glanced at Sardak. And you? I was born here too, but I didn't live here for very long. You see, my mother was a servant.
Sardak is actually my half-brother, Master Zayl.
Selene gave her sibling a loving look.
Born 2 years after myself, our father had him and his mother sent off to a country estate where he was raised. After my mother passed away, father had Sardak brought back.
And do you also share the gift, Master Sardak? I'm very lucky at cards, if that counts. Their brother smirked, taking another deep swig.
He has a trace. No more. The gift is much stronger in me.
Selene met the Wrathmanian's gray eyes.
Although, I never used any of it for gain.
More's the pity, Sardak interjected. Ignoring him, she continued.
I've always been able to sense the intents of those seeking my favor. Until Lord Jin, that is.
And from him?
Utter emptiness. Nothing at all.
Which to Zayl was sufficient indication that this other noble also wielded the gift. The magistrates will side with him on his claims, you say? Selene put down her goblet.
He is a man. I am a woman. And this is Westmarch.
What do you hope to obtain with your conversation with Riordan? The magistrates will certainly not take his testimony. Sardak chuckled. The Wrathmanian's got a sense of humor, even if he doesn't know it himself.
I have no other recourse. I hope that Riordan might be able to tell me something I can use. That's all.
The necromancer frowned. You were waiting for me in the Black Ram. Me, in particular?
Not you.
She murmured, gazing down at the floor.
I waited for something. I didn't know what, but I felt certain that I would find it there. Though it took 5 anxious nights.
If you cannot find the way, wait, and the way will find you, will find you.
It appeared that the words of Rathma applied not only to his loyal followers, but to others as well. Yes, there was definitely more to this than merely a struggle over valuable property. But what it truly concerned, Zayl still did not know. He saw only one course of action that might reveal matters to his satisfaction. You need say no more. I will do what I can to summon the shade of your husband, though I cannot promise if the results will be as you hope.
I expected nothing more.
She was a pragmatic person, something that the necromancer could appreciate. Zayl considered all the factors involved in what he had to do and added, with the rising of the moon tomorrow eve, we can begin. Tomorrow? Sardak did not look at all pleased, which came as no surprise to Zayl. Why not get it over tonight? Because it must be tomorrow night. The Wrathmanian returned, gray eyes boring into the nobles. Sardak slunk back into his chair. Selene Nesardo rose.
Then, you'll be our guest. Until then, Master Zayl.
When he started to speak, she smiled and added,
I'll show you where you can sleep. Sardak, please don't drift off by the fire.
Never fear, sister dear. Once burnt, twice shy.
If you'll follow me, Master Zayl.
Striding gracefully across the room, Lady Nesardo opened the door. The necromancer trailed after her, silent and ever observant of his surroundings. In the corridor, Selene reached up to one of the oil lamps. Only then did Zayl see that each was removable. In addition, a rounded handle hidden on the backside enabled the noblewoman to carry the lamp with ease.
Thank you for doing this.
She whispered. Her eyes glittered in the light of the lamp. I can promise you nothing, Zayl replied, suddenly a bit uncomfortable.
Which is more than I had before.
Selene remarked, turning and leading the way.
Which is much more than I had before.
Luxury was not something a Rathmanian sought, and so Zayl found no comfort in his surroundings. The plush down-filled bed, the high polished rafters, the elegant embroidered rug that had made the journey all the way from Luca Lane, they only made him yearn for the jungles of his home. They also resurrected dark memories. Last time he'd been offered such opulence, it'd been in a far eastern kingdom called Hier. He, Kentrell Dumont, the Vajeri sorcerer Quoth Sin, and the captain's companions had all become the guests of the realm's lord Juris Khan. The finest the kingdom had to offer had been given to the outsiders. There had been only one problem. Hier had proven to be a kingdom of the damned, a place once cast into the realm of hell, whose inhabitants had returned to the mortal plane as soul-sucking monsters. All of those there, only he and Captain Dumont had survived. Zayl clutched his gloved right hand. Barely survived. I'm assuming from the silence that we're alone, came the voice from the pouch. And if we're not, then damn it all anyway, I want out. Be patient, Humbart. The necromancer untied the pouch from his belt and brought it over to the table beside the bed. Undoing the string atop, he reached in and removed the contents. The empty eye sockets of the skull seemed to glare reprovingly at him. About time, echoed a rough voice emanating from somewhere within the fleshless cranium. The skull lacked any jawbone and missed several teeth. There were cracks here and there too, all the results of the fate that had befallen the owner. Well, isn't this a pleasant place? Humbart Wessel had been a treasure hunter, much like Captain Dumont and his men. He had been part of an earlier and no less fatal journey to reach Lost Hier. Only in Humbart's case, death had come from a high fall when he had attempted to return to the city on his own some years later. A young Zayl, avidly studying the lore concerning Hier, had come across the remains and had animated the skull in search of answers. Somehow, he never managed to get around to sending the mercenary spirit back to the netherworld. Not that Humbart appeared to be in any hurry. They had traveled much together, and Despite the skull's earthly tendencies and outspoken attitude, Humbart had more than once proven the difference between Zayl's own life and death. That included Ure, especially. The Wrathmanian set the skull square on the table, giving its owner the best view possible. Despite having no eyes, Humbart saw. He could also hear, smell, and of course speak. At times the spirit grumbled that he would have traded all of these for the ability to eat and engage in mortal pleasures. But for the most part, he seemed satisfied just to exist.
Such a pleasant place.
The skull repeated.
Like the curtains. So, tell me, is the grand lady of the house as elegant as this? And as pretty a thing as her voice makes her sound?
The matter is hardly of our concern. Somehow the remains managed to snort.
Spoken like one of Rathma's own. How is it you lot have managed to survive the ages with such a lack of romantic notions?
As he had so often, Zayl let that gibe too pass. Instead, he stepped to the huge rug and sat down. Crossing his legs, he pushed back his hood and stared at the wall before him.
Zayl, lad! There's a lush, sweet bed right there for the enjoyment. For my sake, use it. How often do we get a chance for such as...
Hush, Humbart. You know that is not my way. The skull grumbled, then made no other sound. Wrathmanians generally did not sleep much. They sank into a form of a trance that enabled their bodies to get the rest they needed while their senses continued to explore and expand upon their abilities. It was a necessity, the necromancers ever needing to hone their skills in their effort to protect the balance. Zayl stared at a point on the wall, but his eyes no longer saw it. Almost immediately, the room faded into the background, replaced by a grayish haze. It was his intention to discover more about the House of Nesardo, especially what its earliest history entailed. The malevolent force that had nearly struck him down in the coach was somehow bound in part to this location. But why? One by one, Zayl peeled away the shields he had built to protect his mind from the earlier assault. Each step was a cautious one, for eagerness would only lead to disaster. But instead of the malevolent force against which had earlier fought, the necromancer discovered something else. A faint but definite presence. It permeated the walls, the floors, the very timbers of the House of Nesardo. He probed deeper and deeper and found layers to this presence. It was everywhere, existing as the edifice itself did, a part of it as much as any nail or bit of stone. A gasp escaped his still body when at last he recognized it for what it was. A collective of souls. Their numbers were legion. Zayl had never come across so many in one place, not even in the oldest cemeteries or burial chambers of the East. More astounding, the souls before him existed in a semi-conscious state, unaware of their deaths, but also unaware of the mortal world. He felt them reliving their lives over and over, like actors in a play without end. They did not mingle, yet coexisted so intimately that the necromancer knew that they drew from one another. Fascinated, Zayl observed a few. A woman clad in a voluminous ball gown covered in glittering jewels spoke gaily with the open air. Near her, a grim countenanced swordman of middle years swung his blade desperately at what seemed to be 3 or 4 foes. 2 toddlers, twins, played with one another. Their faces were marked with pox, a clear sign of the reason for their earlier departure from the mortal plane. Curiously, they were the ones who finally noticed him. Although Zayl had no true form, to them he would have appeared much as he did in life. The toddlers seized their game, one involving a ball and small stick figures, and gazed up solemnly at the necromancer. The one with the ball finally said to him, the mouth remaining still. The child held the ball up for Zayl to take.
I do not know the game,
he replied, his own lips moving. This admission caused the twins to lose interest in him. They turned back to their playing, bouncing the ball between them and then choosing a stick figure from the group. A moment later, the twins faded into the background, indistinct but still visible. Only as he studied more of the shades did Zayl see common trait among them. They all had eyes similar, if not identical, to Selene Nesardo. Were these the souls, then, of the many generations of her house? If so, the bloodline of Nesardo had once been far more fertile. Fascinated, he moved on, gazing at one reenactment after another. Lovers, liars, scholars, fools, fighters, and cowards. The ill, the impractical, the impressionable. The gathered souls of Nesardo covered the spectrum of human frailties and triumphs. Then it occurred to him that Riordan Nesardo should be among them. The necromancer concentrated, silently repeating the man's name. Doing so bettered the chance that the shade would be drawn to him. It seemed possible that Zayl might be able to elicit not only the answers Selene needed, but also a few of those he desired.
Riordan, Riordan, husband of Selene, come to me, Riordan.
Of all the souls here, Riordan had been the most recent addition and therefore the easiest to call. The pull to the mortal plane was strongest at the moment of death and weakest as years went on. Summoning a shade from centuries past required far more effort than summoning one but weeks gone from life. Of course, from what Zayl had witnessed here so far, those rules meant nothing to the shades of Nesardo. Many of those the Rothmanian had so far studied had been dead hundreds of years, yet they seemed as freshly passed on as the most recent lord. And where was Riordan? Zayl still could not sense that particular soul anywhere. He of all those here should have reacted to the necromancer's presence. Instead, some of the other specters began to notice the stranger in their midst. The woman in the extravagant gown paused to stare, her lip trembling. The swordsman staggered, shaking his hand and clutching several suddenly bloody wounds. His eyes locked upon Zayl with a mixture of denial and rage. A pair of lovers, their haunted faces revealing the telltale sign of poisoning on their lips, clutched one another in sudden fright. And then the dead began a horrific transformation. Their skin quickly shriveled and decayed, crumbling off their bodies in great pieces. Rich garments blackened and tattered. Frightened eyes sank into fleshless skulls. Zayl had intruded too deep. The shades were beginning to understand their deaths. They were seeing that what they truly now was nothing more than a facade, that their true selves were moldering away in crypts, graves, or earth, or worse. The necromancer immediately retreated. As he did, he felt the sensation of despair, fear, and anger that had arisen all around him begin to subside. Just as Zayl had hoped by his leaving the dead alone, they had reacted like the twins, losing interest in the intrusion and slipping back into their perpetual activities. As the misty realm faded away, Zayl took one last look to verify his suspicions. The necromancer caught a fleeting glimpse of the woman in the gown. Once more she was the focus of an invisible ball, resplendent in her costume and obviously being chatted up by the gentlemen admirers. The cadaverous corpse of a moment before was gone, and there was no sign that she recalled his intrusion at all. Relief coursed through Zayl as he drifted back to his body. He had come very close to upsetting something core to the secrets of House Nesardo. He could have caused a catastrophe to the balance. There was a particular reason why those of the bloodline returned here after death, one that he was determined to unveil. More and more the Wrathmanian saw that his encounter with Selene had not come about completely by chance, and certainly had to do with more than contacting the spirit of her husband. And for that matter, where was Lord Nesardo? Why had he not answered a call that few dead souls could deny? The myriad paths lay before him, intrigued Zayl. Caught up in trying to puzzle them out, he paid little mind to his return to his mortal shell, an act almost as reflexive to him as breathing. That is, until he discovered that he could not enter. Something else had gotten to his body before him. It clearly sought to claim his form for its own. Zayl probed, but found nothing to identify its origins. It was not one of the souls he had discovered. Of that the Wrathmanian was certain. Curiously, he sensed some familiarity with it, but exactly what that meant escaped the necromancer. Then, all that concerned Zayl was claiming what was rightfully his. Whatever intruder it was that usurped his body, it lacked the natural ties that Zayl had. A Wrathmanian knew how to strengthen those bonds, even in precarious situations like this. To understand death as they did, necromancers also had to understand life, and so Zayl knew well what kept a soul attached to its body. He focused his will on those ties, strengthening them, using them to their utmost. Whether or not the intruder chose to leave, Zayl intended to enter. What felt like a solid wall briefly obstructed his way, but it could not deny the strength of which bound the Wrathmanian to his mortal form. Zayl pushed, slowly but inexorably making his way, and as he bit by bit re-entered his body, he began to become aware of his surroundings. The first thing Zayl noticed was that Humbart was screaming. The skull's voice rang loudly throughout the room, and no doubt a good portion of the building.
Drop it, damn you, lad! What's going on to you? Drop it, I say!
As his mortal senses took over, the Wrathmanian felt tension fill his body. He realized that he was standing, and that his arms were stretched before him. In his left hand, Zayl's bone dagger was turned toward his chest. The only thing that had prevented it from being driven in was his gloved right hand, which held the other wrist in a death grip. The two limbs struggled with such violence that the necromancer's body shook.
Listen to me, Zayl, lad!
The skull continued.
Wake up! This isn't you!
Someone pounded on the door. Zayl heard Selene's voice, but what she said he could not understand. The necromancer focused his will on forcing the left hand to drop the dagger. At first it resisted, but then one finger curled open, followed by another. Without warning, Zayl recovered full use of his rebellious hand. The rest of his fingers opened and the dagger dropped onto the rug. At the same moment, the insidious invader within vanished. Gasping, Zayl dropped to one knee, his right hand still clutching the other wrist.
Zayl! You're awake! Praise be!
Although unable to answer, the necromancer was by no means inactive. His mind swept the vicinity, seeking any trace of his unseen foe. Yet despite a thorough search, Zayl discovered only one thing amiss. Selene Nesardo stood next to him. Zayl knew very well that he had bolted the door, the better not to be disturbed while in a trance. He has also lain 3 subtle spells around the entrance, ensuring that no one would enter without his permission. But the noblewoman had done just that, which spoke volumes about her gift.
Zayl!
Salene gasped, taking him by the shoulders.
What happened here?
She had not witnessed the struggle, Zayl realized. All Salene likely knew was that there had been a commotion, and that somehow the necromancer had been injured. The Rathmanian decided it was best for her not to know the full truth, at least for now. My own fault. I was attempting some study of the forces inundating the building and overextended myself. I was foolish.
Overextended himself?
Humbart! Salene gasped,
Who said that?
her gaze fixed on the skull.
It came from you?
Zayl finally ignored them both, instead taking up the dagger with his right hand. He stared at it, thinking, whatever had sought his body had desired his death and had chosen his dagger, an integral part of the Rathmanian calling as the tool. Coincidence? Perhaps. But there was something about the entire incident that made Zayl suspect that the thing knew much concerning the necromancer. Too much. The followers of Rathma kept their ways and methods most secret from outsiders. What had he stumbled upon? Caribidas studied his dagger, its faint glow giving it an especially ethereal look. He frowned, not disappointed, but also not pleased. He sat on the stone floor of a chamber completely unlit save for the light from the blade. His cloak and robes were draped across the floor in such a manner that it almost looked as if it had melted into the stone. In the darkness surrounding him, something large scuttled about.
Calm yourself, my love.
He muttered to the shadows.
It was to be expected, but it will be remedied.
Caribidas placed the bone-wide dagger in his belt and rose up with just the aid of his legs. His voice carried only detachment.
The balance will be set proper again. It will be at all necessary costs.
As evening neared, a violent storm swept over the city. The worst of it finally centering over House Nesardo. There, the tempest appeared to stall, as if a plant setting down roots. It raged and raged with no sign of lessening.
There always seem to be storms.
Zayl thought, as thunder once again racked the building.
Yet, rain is no more evil than the sun or moon. It is only that those who work dark deeds prefer to cloak their evil with it.
He took the thought to heart as he readied himself for his spell work. Zayl had the sample of blood from Selene and the tools he would need for drawing up the pattern. She, in turn, promised to bring with her 3 items of close personal value to the late Ria Redan. All they needed now to do was to descend into the crypt. With Humbart in the pouch, the Rathmanian returned to the main corridor downstairs. Selene already awaited him there. Both a lit lamp in one hand stood protectively behind her. The Lady Nesardo wore reasonable attire for journeying below the earth. A riding outfit with green pants and leather boots, besides a similar colored cotton blouse over which was buttoned a black leather vest. A matching belt with a small sheathed dagger completed her ensemble. The noblewoman smiled anxiously as the tall, slim figure approached.
I've brought the articles you mentioned.
She held up a sack that clinked, indicating that at least 2 of the pieces were in some part made of metal. Then, if you will lead the way. Lifting another of the lamps from the nearest wall, Selene complied. Wolf left her to take up a position at the rear. For the bodyguard to choose such a place was a clear sign that, in the crypt of Nesardo, Polth considered Zayl the only questionable factor. The necromancer did not find it odd that the family would have its crypt beneath its home, for the practice was not unknown in Lane or the eastern half of the world. The powerful and wealthy seemed especially covetous of their dead, as if their mortal shells were any more value than those of the lowest beggars in the streets. Yet, there was something more to House Nesardo's crypt, something that made the necromancer eager to see it. As Selene guided them through the house, he sensed again the collective of souls beneath his feet, and unidentifiable energies that seemed to either coalesce around them, or that were perhaps the reason for their being there at all. The trio descended a series of stone steps that took them beneath ground level. They passed empty, dust-laden chambers whose burial history Zayl could sense from the stark emotional impressions still lingering. Selene suddenly hesitated. Turning to the necromancer, she said,
My family is not without its black deeds, Master Zayl.
He nodded, the only answer that his hostess required. As one with a gift, Selene had likely felt the emanations from these chambers throughout most of her life, and so suspected that he now did also. At the end of the corridor, they descended once more. The Rathmanian tensed, aware that they were very near their destination. Moments later, they confronted a thick iron door. Selene held her lamp close, revealing an 8-sided starburst pattern set in the center. Pulse stepped up to the front and, after handing his lamp to Zayl, tugged tight on the rounded handle. The bodyguard pulled the ancient door open, a grating squeal accompanying its movement. A torrent of whispering voices rushed up to meet Zayl. They spoke not to him, though, nor to any living thing. They were the voices of the very dead he had confronted earlier, the voices of Nesardo's past, reliving their former lives over and over. As Polth retrieved his lamp, Zayl noted Selene watching him intently.
Sometimes,
she murmured.
Sometimes I think I hear my ancestors when I come down here.
Lady Nesardo turned and entered. With Polth close at his back, the necromancer did the same. And, as he first beheld the crypt, Zayl realized that his visit among the dead earlier had given him only a mere indication of their final resting place. Although the shadows hid the full enormity, the edifice clearly ran the length of the house and beyond. Zayl did a quick estimation and decided that it covered most of the family grounds. The ceiling was as high as that of many cathedrals. He and his companions actually stood at the top of yet another set of steps which led down to the meticulously built stone floor. To each side, vaults at least 10 high held the remains of Selene's bloodline. White polished stone markers covered each space, the name and dates of the individual carved on them. The vaults continued on into the darkness, not one space in the immediate vicinity empty.
We will have to walk a little farther,
whispered Selene, stepping down.
Riordan's place is midway through this chamber.
Are there other levels?
3. One bears the bodies of loyal servants. The deepest is actually not from my family. It was an earlier crypt. The first Nesardos built this upon it.
The Rathmanian's brow wrinkled. Where would one... She shook her head.
You can't descend to it. The entrance caved in some centuries past during a quake. I know of it only because Riordan was always fascinated with our family history and uncovered the knowledge in his research.
More than ever, Zayl wished to commune with the late Lord Nesardo's shade. There was much that Riordan might be able to explain beyond Selene's current needs. A layer of gray ash covered the floor. Vague footprints preceded the three. One pair matched Selene's in size and shape. So deep underground the dust came, but came slowly. From the number of prints and their pattern of movement, he knew them to have been created during Riordan's burial procession some years back. Glancing at his hostess, Zayl saw her unconsciously retracing her steps. He wondered if she now relived that tragic moment. Deep below the surface they might be. That did not mean the crypt was devoid of life. Scavenger beetles, some as large as Zayl's palm, scattered out of sight as the lamps illuminated the way. Millipedes burrowed into cracks in vaults. Most astounding of all, though, were the shroud-like webs draping so many parts of the crypt. Several were large enough to cover a man, and in them could be seen tombs of another kind, the wrapped, shriveled bodies of the spider's victims. Most were other insects, but a few were small rats, no doubt sickly ones to have fallen prey to their much tinier arachnids.
When Riordan died, I had an army of workers clear this crypt of such vermin,
said Selene with a disgusted survey of the webs.
I can't believe it's gotten this bad again. Where do they come from?
Zayl did not reply, for he was instead caught up in the ever-increasing intensity of psychic emanations. Each vault's inhabitant existed in the same dreamlike state, their spirits active when they should have either rested or gone on. The whispers had reached such a level that he was, at times, tempted to cover his ears. They had gone only a few steps more when the noblewoman suddenly paused. A look in her eyes was all the information the necromancer needed, but a glance up at the marble plate just above her head verified that they had indeed come upon the mortal remains of Lord Nesardo. If you would prefer a moment to yourself, my lady.
No. I've had enough such moments since his death. I cared for my husband, Master Zayl, even loved him in a certain way, and likely always will. But now I think it's best to continue with what we must, and leave him in peace.
But the cowled spellcaster was not so certain that it would be as easy as Selene thought. From Riordan's vault, Zayl suddenly realized that he sensed nothing. This was the only vault where no spirit was active. Why that? When all the others could not rest. Such questions would, he hoped, be answered very soon. I shall work here, then, he returned, reaching into his cloak and removing a piece of white chalk from a pouch. If I may have some room, please. As Selene and Polth stepped back, Zayl knelt. He placed his own lamp next to him, and began drawing a 5-sided pattern. In the corner of each, he drew the 5 elements as Rathma preached them: earth, air, fire, water, and time. In the center, the outline of a serpentine form, and under it a downward arch. This was a simplified version of the symbol representing Tragal, one commonly used for spellcasting. As the fulcrum of the balance, the dragon was bound to all the elements, and they to him. Although the symbol was simplified, the overall pattern was far more complex than Zayl had often utilized in the past. Myriad symbols soon decorated each of its borders. The necromancer suspected that all of them would be necessary if he hoped to achieve results. When the pattern was finally complete, he reached into his large pouch and removed HUMBART.
What a depressing place.
The skull growled.
I wouldn't be caught dead here if I had any choice in the matter, that is.
From Selene's direction came a brief chuckle, while from Polth there emerged only a grunt. His having expected the shade of Lord Nesardo to possibly appear at some point. A talking skull evidently seemed far less astounding to the bodyguard. Quiet, HUMBART, the necromancer murmured. He placed the fleshless head in the center, over the mark of Tragal. There were times when uses arose for the skull, and this was one of them. As a soul midway between the afterworld and the mortal plane, HUMBART Wessel offered a link like no other. He was yet another precaution Zayl had put in place to better his chances of reaching Selene's departed mate.
Don't know why I'm doing this,
HUMBART continued to grumble.
Them souls are all so flighty, so full of their misery and loss. If I had a stomach, it'd empty from all their whining.
That said, the spirit stilled. The Rathmanian retrieved the tiny vial of blood donated by Selene, then, with the tip of his dagger, drew the contents up onto the blade. He took the weapon and outlined a circle around the skull and the mark. Looking up at the noblewoman, Zayl said, "The items, please." Selene handed him a sack. The necromancer reached in and removed the pieces one at a time. The first was a ceremonial dagger with the Nesardo symbol etched into the hilt, a hilt that looked to be pure gold. The edge of the weapon was blunt, the item for show, not for use. The second piece Zayl removed was a blue silken scarf such as the Rathmanian had seen adorning the throats of a couple of returning nobles aboard ship. Imported from across the Twin Seas, such an item marked Riordan's high status in Westmarch. Setting the scarf and dagger outside the circle of blood, Zayl located the last piece in the sack, a medallion with a golden chain. The necromancer frowned as he gazed upon it. The chain was of recent forging, but the medallion was much, much more ancient. More ancient than the House Nesardo, in fact. The metallic piece had almost been worn smooth by time, but he made out a shape. A head with 8 limbs sprouting from it. Zayl frowned, trying to recall anything in his teachings that matched such an image. When nothing did, he reluctantly added the final item to its proper place outside the circle. I will begin the summoning now, he informed Salene. It would be best if you were next to me so that your near proximity can enhance our hopes of success. Without hesitation, she complied. Her sudden closeness momentarily distracted Zayl, who was more used to performing summonings without another nearby. He sensed her power pulsate with each breath she took, the gift so naturally a part of her that the woman likely did not know the potential she carried. Pulse suddenly stirred. Zayl assumed that he was somehow the cause for the bodyguard's reaction, but Pulse, hand on his weapon, instead peered into the darkness farther in.
What is it, Pulse?
Nothing, mistress. One of the vermin, I suppose.
The necromancer held the ivory dagger over the center and began to murmur. He felt energy swirl around him, gathering for the spell. The whispers of the ghosts halted as they felt the intrusion into their plane begin.
Riordan,
Zayl silently called.
Riordan Nesardo, husband of Salene. Riordan, Lord of House Nesardo.
Several previous lords of the manor briefly stirred, then returned to their dream states when they realized it was not they whom the necromancer sought. Zayl had learned from the earlier incident to focus more, so as not to recreate the havoc he had caused those souls. The crypt had always been cool, but now a stiff chill filled it. Selene abruptly shivered and Pulse let out a low curse. To the Rathmanian, however, the sudden shift in temperature was a promising sign. It meant that his spell was indeed reaching into the spirit world.
Riordan, Riordan Nesardo, come to us. Come, the hour of your bride's needs.
A reluctant soul was often more willing to respond if a loved one was so involved. Zayl felt the sun stirring. He manipulated the dagger over the pattern, uttering words passed down by Rothma to his followers, words in a language known only to the faithful. And nothing further happened. The necromancer sensed that something wanted to come, but that other forces held it back. Without glancing at Selene, Zayl said, My lady, if you would place one hand on the hilt of the dagger, I would ask then that you softly call your husband's name. She obeyed without question, clearly trusting in his knowledge and skills. Zayl adjusted his grip so that she could properly touch the hilt, and focused his spellwork to coincide with her summons.
Riordan?
Noblewoman whispered to the silent crypt.
Riordan? Can you hear me? It's Selene. Please, Riordan. I need to speak with you.
Now the presence stirred anew, pressing closer, but something still held it back. The necromancer had a vague impression of a winged form. He grabbed for Selene. Down! Something's coming, lad, roared Humbart. I think it might be... A flesh-rending howl filled the crypt, echoing over and over again. Rats, insects, and arachnids scattered in primal terror. From the webs and dust formed a monstrous thing with wide wings, both fiery and yet dry and decayed. Its body was a cadaverous corpse with not even enough flesh left to cover its bones. There was some semblance of a face, a man's, so it seemed, with wisps of hair and even some beard remaining. But there were no eyes left, only black pits, and the howling skeletal mouth was distended beyond mortal limits. The arms, too, stretched far beyond anything human and, like a bat's limbs, were part of the wings. The remaining fingers were twisted talons, clearly capable of shredding. Even as it coalesced, the ghastly shade soared down upon them. Zayl had barely thrown Salene to the floor before the fiendish shadow passed directly over them. Had they been still kneeling, it would have gone through their bodies.
What is it?
Blurted the noblewoman.
Is that Riordan?
No, it's a wraith, a damned soul. And what it was doing here now was of a special interest to the Rathmanian. Unfortunately, before he can consider the reasons, he first had to survive the encounter. Polth, take her! He need not have even spoken. The bodyguard had already leaned down to seize his mistress. Polth lifted Salene to her feet as if she weighed nothing. He then kept one protective arm around her while with the other he brandished his weapon. But a sword was no match for a wraith. Rolling to his feet, the necromancer brought up his dagger. Not at all to his surprise, the monstrous spirit fixated on him. Wraiths ever thirst for what they no longer had, and spellcasters often offered them a double bounty. Both Zayl's life force and his magic presented a bounty. They would not slake the horror's thirst. Nothing mortal could, but that would not keep the wraith from draining him of everything regardless. And then it would go after Salene, who also had the gift. Eyes on the shrieking ghoul, Zayl commanded, "Take her upstairs. It will not follow out of the crypt. Go!"
No, I won't leave you alone.
The Lady Nesardo struggled to escape Polth's ursine grip.
Mistress, you must come.
The giant began dragging her toward the distant steps. With a chilling scream, the wraith flew down at Zayl. Although its origins had once been human, it no longer had a lower torso. Instead, a savage bony tail whipped back and forth, acting almost like a scorpion's sting. The sinister shade was not in any way corporeal, but if any part passed through the Rathmanian, it would be as if 100 blades had been thrust into his heart. And that agony would pale in comparison to what he would suffer when the wraith began to suck him dry. Muttering quickly, Zayl held the dagger up. From the nearest vaults, a torrent of bones burst through the marble. They tumbled in front of the necromancer, forming in an instant a wall whose brilliant illumination matched that of the dagger. Zayl disliked disturbing the bones of Selene's kin, but had no choice. The wraith veered off just before it would have touched the bone barrier. It shrieked angrily, seeking a way around Zayl's spell. That would not take long either. In truth, such a defense would hold little against the monster. The necromancer sought only a delay so that he could prepare a better defense. At least with the focus on him, Salene was safe. But then from the shadows, he sensed the movements of others. Risking himself, he glanced toward the darkened steps. "Get her out of here, Polth, quickly! There!" Finally, having determined that the bones were no menace to it, the wraith chose that moment to plunge. As As it flowed through the barrier, the bones quivered, and the entire structure collapsed in a heap. Zayl brought up the dagger again, but too late. He turned the ghoulish creature aside, but one wing passed through his torso. It was as if someone had stolen a piece of his soul. Crying out, the Rothmanian dropped to one knee. It was all he could do to keep a grip on the dagger.
Zayl, lad! There's a foul beast atop the vaults! A big, hairy bastard of a spider thing with fangs and claws. And by my lost soul, there's another!
Low, sibilant hisses coming from all sides, even from overhead, now filled the crypt. Several monstrous forms dropped through the thick webs above. Selene screamed. Through pain-racked eyes, Zayl saw the darkened figures of her and Pole suddenly surrounded by at least 4 hunching shapes that would have been nearly as tall as the bodyguard if standing straight. They seemed some hellish cross between men and giant black arachnids. Pole held them at bay with his sword, the creatures moving about on the back floor of their macabre limbs, paced around the pair in clear preparation for a group attack. One opened wide, its lip was small, hissing and revealing a pair of huge fangs such as the necromancer had seen on jungle spiders of the most virulent toxicity. But concern for Selene and Pole faded into the back of his mind as Zayl sensed the wraith returning for him. He rolled out of the way just as the specter dropped into the area where he had been kneeling.
Come and try that on me!
Snapped Humbart.
I'll take you on with no hands to tie behind my back.
The wraith moaned at the skull with a vicious beat of its ethereal wing, somehow sent Humbart rolling. He swore as he collided with one of the walls, but his distraction did what it was supposed to. Given the chance to recover enough, Zayl cast another spell. A spear of bone formed in the air before the Rothmanian. With a single word more, Zayl sent it flying at the wraith. The talon of Trangal was a weapon both physical and mystical. That the wraith had no mortal substance made no difference. The talon's target turned just as the spear reached it. The wraith sought to twist out of the way but moved too slow. Zayl's missile tore through its side. A shriek more horrifying than any previous escaped the specter. Still screaming, it turned and vanished into the deeper section of the crypt. Gasping from his efforts, the necromancer looked at Selene and Pole. Their grotesque attackers had finally worked up their strategy. One leapt up onto the vaults, then to the ceiling where it dropped down toward the bodyguard. Pole instinctively shifted to meet it. The moment he reacted, 2 others, the foremost crawling across the opposing vaults, charged Selene. She was evidently not the helpless figure that they thought her. The crimson-haired noblewoman gestured toward the one leaping at her from the vault, and a bolt of ice struck the hellish arachnid square in the chest. Hurled back at the wall, it hit with a bone-cracking thud and crumpled in a heap on the floor. Frost covered its entire body and sprinkled the air around the corpse. Selene gaped at what she'd done. The second horror tried to use her shock to its advantage. Fangs dripping, claws out, it lunged for her throat. There was a flash of icy blue light, and in its brief illumination, what appeared to be a shield of some sort came between Selene and the fangs. Howling, the monster pulled back, its paw completely frozen solid. Again, Selene seemed startled at what was clearly her own handiwork. Pulp had managed to avoid the first creature's plunge at him. With expert swordplay, he drove it back, then seeing a moment, turned and ran one through with ruined paw. But then another leapt out of the shadows, bowling the giant over from behind. 2 more of the demonic arachnids joined their comrade in assaulting the bodyguard. Without hesitation, Zayl threw his dagger. The glowing blade flew unerringly at his target, sinking into the back of one of the creatures. Hissing sharply, the man spider spun in a circle, grasping frantically for the deeply buried weapon. The fact that it was still buried there startled the Rathmanian utterly. By rights, the dagger should have returned to him once its grisly task had been done. By blood and sacrifice, it had been bound to his conscious will years ago. If he desired it to come to him, it did. Not now. Only then did Zayl understand that he had played right into someone's hand. The sixth beast fell out of the dark webs above him, hissing lustily as it landed upon the spellcaster. The heavy weight crushed Zayl onto the floor, nearly knocking him unconscious. He felt clawed hands tear at his back, rending his garments with ease and leaving bloody gashes in his flesh. Burning venom dripped onto the back of his neck. Zayl was not easily subdued. He slammed his elbow into his adversary's midsection and heard a satisfactory grunt of pain. Some of the weight vanished, enough so that the Rathmanian could turn on his back and better face his foe. The monstrosity snapped at him with yellow fangs as long as Zayl's fingers. Its breath stank of the grave, yet the eyes were the most unsettling aspect of all, for Zayl could have sworn that they carried in them a human trait. Then the Rathmanian's gaze shifted upward, and he saw an odd growth atop the head of the fiend. After a moment, the necromancer realized that it was a separate creature, a smaller spider, but one still larger than his hand. It stared in his direction with baleful red orbs, its own smaller fangs twitching evilly. The revelation almost undid Zayl, for his astonishment gave the larger fiend the chance to tighten his grip. The fangs drew near the necromancer's throat, and suddenly a fist struck the monster on the side of the head. The beast tumbled back. Pulse filled Zayl's view. The bodyguard's uniform was ripped to shreds, and he had scars everywhere, but he wore a triumphant grin.
My thanks, Master Zayl.
Pulse rumbled.
The one you took from me, it was enough. The other two, they fled, having learned their folly.
Sure enough, other than the Rathmanian's foe, the only creatures left were the dead ones. Even as Pulth helped Zayl rise, the final creature scurried back up into the shadows. The necromancer frowned. He was forced to acknowledge that he could not magically sense the creatures. They were a complete blank to his abilities. Small wonder that he'd been caught off guard by the one dropping from above. Another concern took over. Zayl tried to look past the imposing bodyguard. Selene, is she?
Untouched she is, but unharmed, I can't say.
Zayl saw why. Selene Nesardo stood where he had last noted her, both arms wrapped tight around herself. She stared at the beast she had slain, and Zayl knew right then that this was the first life that his hostess had ever taken. That it was some monstrous creature seeking her own death did not matter. Humbart's skull lay eye sockets up. A low mutter flowed from the late mercenary's fleshless head, much of it having to do with wishes for a good sword arm and a pair of legs. Aware that if his companion would grumble so, he was undamaged. Zayl went first for his dagger, still tight in the back of his victim. As he stumbled along, he crossed what was left of the spell pattern.
Wait, please, wait, please, wait, please, listen, please, listen, please.
The frantic intensity of the voice suddenly inside Zayl's head made him clutch his skull in renewed pain. He concentrated, drawing up mental shields that made the cry more tolerable.
He seeks the moon. The moon seeks the moon. He has it, but it is not the moon, but it is the moon. And if the moon is held to the moon, then the spider will come again.
Zayl tried his best to make sense of the rambling words, He knew immediately their source. Lord Nesardo had finally responded, albeit neither in the manner expected, nor on the subject for which his shade had been sought. But his frenetic tone indicated that this was a warning that needed to be told more than anything else, and that was what mattered now.
What do you mean?
The necromancer thought.
What of the spider? What of the moon?
A vague, misty form drew together near the vault where Selene's husband had been buried.
Spider, moon, spider, moon, spider, moon, moon, spider, moon, spider, moon of the spider, moon of the spider. The time comes, the spider comes, Astrogah comes.
Astrogah? Zayl blurted. Something about the name struck a chord. Moon of the Spider?
Zayl!
Riordan's presence vanished from his head, as did the shadow on the vault. Zayl heard Polt's swearing voice and realized that the one who had called the necromancer's name had been Salene.
Look out, lad!
Added Humbart.
It's back!
Strong hands grabbed the Rothmanian, tossing him far. Zayl landed atop the very beast toward which he had been heading. His face slid against the hilt of his dagger. He instinctively seized the mystical weapon, tugging it free and spinning around to see what was happening. The shriek that filled the crypt was answer enough even before Zayl finished turning. The Wraith had returned, seeking to feast upon the distracted spellcaster. But Polt had thrown Zayl out of its imminent path. The bodyguard stood defiantly, his sword out again just as the wailing specter fell upon him. Yet where the Rothmanian might have had some defense, the fighter did not. The Wraith coursed through him without pause, its talon wings seeming to grasp at Polt's chest as it did. The giant screamed. His body shook and his skin shriveled. The sword fell from his crumbling fingers. Polt's desiccated flesh turned to ash, and even before he fell, there was little left of him but a skeleton. The Wraith continued on, its hunger unabated. Selene stood directly before it, the noblewoman so horrified by the death of her loyal servant that she stood frozen. Zayl held a dagger before him, point down. He spouted out the words to dispel as quickly as he could. Polt had perished for him. He would not let the same fate befall Selene. The pale illumination spread from the dagger to the Wraith, enveloping the winged fiend as if in one of the spider's webs. The Wraith shrieked as it still sought Selene, who stood barely a yard from its vile reach. Standing, the necromancer cried, "Ult al-Ratma! Sin!" The light pulled back into the blade, and with it came the thrashing specter. The creature howled and flapped as hard as it could, but was unable to escape the hold. Zayl shuddered with effort, for the spell he used drew from his own soul. Yet, if he let up in the least, the Rothmanian knew full well the Wraith would have both the noblewoman and him. His spell was a variation of the life tap that a necromancer could use to revitalize himself with the essence of a foe. It was ever a dangerous spell, for in taking in the life of another, one risked taking on the victim's attributes. There were legends of Rothmanians who had literally become their vanquished enemies, necromancers who had then turned to the side of hell until hunted down by their brethren. But what Zayl attempted now had even greater risks. He had combined the life tap with a mastery spell, generally used on the recently deceased. Utilized against a common shade, there would have been little risk. But here, Zayl sought control against one of the most malevolent of the undead. Worst was the fact that, though what he absorbed now weakened his adversary, it also sickened the Rathmanian. Zayl took not life into him, but the undeath that was the Wraith's essence. The coldness that filled the human was one that even a servant of the balance could not tolerate and live. Passing above Pulse's ravaged corpse, the shrieking wraith neared the blade. Zayl gritted his teeth. He had one last spell in mind, but he wanted the specter contained as much as possible before he attempted it, or else all the necromancer would accomplish was slaying the noblewoman and himself. Closer. Closer. There! Zayl focused on the bodyguard's remains. Pulse's corpse exploded, the anguish of his death a most powerful force. Zayl steered that force at the wraith. Amplified by the necromancer's magic, the death energies overwhelmed the specter, burning it away. The wraith managed one final angry shriek and vanished without a trace. Zayl tried to unbind himself from the wraith's destruction, but his effort was not entirely successful. The deathly energies enveloped him, and the last thing he heard was Selene's cry. Four. Selene insisted that Zayl rest for a day before he began the summoning, but the necromancer needed no such respite and, in fact, was more eager than ever to call up the spirit of Lord Nesardo. Twice now he had been assaulted by mysterious forces, but the more he meditated on that which had sought to slay him by his own hand, the more he felt the second assault separate from the first. There might be a factor that bound them together, but the latter attack had a more mortal feel to it. Could it be this Lord Jinn? If so, then he had studied the followers of Rathma closer than most. The necromancer was very much interested in meeting this particular noble. The skies remained dark the next day, an omen to Zayl, but one he did not mention to his hostess. He suddenly began his mental preparations, aware that this summoning would surely not be like most. There were wards and other defenses he would need to prepare. Sardak slept most of the day away, but Selene came early to see if there was any way in which she could assist the necromancer. Zayl found her quite different from the usual women of her station, and even most of the men. That had to do with more than merely her gift, something the Rathmanian had run across on occasion when dealing with other nobles. Selene Nesardo was strong of personality and will, and braver than many others. Humbart was a perfect example. Selene's initial shock did not give way to abhorrence, but rather fascination. When she returned in the morning, she greeted the skull as if he were as much of a guest as Zayl, an act which tickled the spirit to no end. Humbart would have regaled her with story after story of their adventures, somehow with him taking the physical lead, but a glance from the necromancer cut him off. He also kept the promise that Zayl had forced out of him after the noblewoman had departed following the attack, that Selene was not to know what had really happened. Under normal circumstances, Zayl would have needed little time before commencing. But with all he had so far experienced, and the fact that Selene's husband had not answered him during the necromancer's excursion into the netherworld, the Rathmanian wanted all factors in his favor. The hour after midnight, he finally informed Selene, and her just waking brother before the place of burial.
That would be below the house, in the crypt.
Zayl had assumed that House Nesardo had such a place, and suspected that it was the nexus to which the souls he had discovered had been drawn. Good. Then, from somewhere without, a great bell rung once, twice, 3 times. It had a finality to it that caught the necromancer's interest immediately.
The bells,
Muttered Selene, eyes narrowing sadly. She glanced at Sardak, who was, for once, sober.
King Cornelius is finally dead.
Took long enough, Sardak replied. When I die, I want it to be quick, not lingering for weeks like that. Some fragments of conversation that Zayl had heard when departing the ship had brought him to Westmarch came back. He knew that the king of the land had been ill, but not to what extent. A new sense of urgency struck the Rathmanian. This death was too timely for his tastes. Has the king and hier? He asked.
3 sons originally, 1 dead as a youth.
Lady Nesardo pursed her lips.
His hier's namesake died from a spider bite while out on the countryside some months back. Now it's to be Justinian, the 4th of that name.
Justinian the Wide-Eyed, some of us call him, Sardak added, not looking at all pleased. As naive a boy as any ever lived, and he's no older than I.
He had no idea he would be king, Sardak. Everyone expected it to be Cornelius the Younger.
Which will not help Westmarch at the moment, sister. A wise old ruler dead of sickness. A promising hier poisoned by accident. An untried, unready successor. A spider? Zayl suddenly muttered. A poisonous spider? Are they common here?
Actually, very rare, but...
Selene got no further, for just then, a white-haired female servant appeared. Wringing her hands and trying not to look at the necromancer, the servant announced,
Mistress, General Torion is at the door. General Torion?
The noble woman looked perplexed. Perhaps he comes to spirit you off to Ingstein, dear sister. Should I pack your things?
Hush, Sardak. Fiona, please tell the good general that I really haven't the time.
Surely you do. At least this day.
Boomed a voice from behind the servant. Fiona let out a squeak and rushed away. In her place, there came an epitome of a polished, capable soldier that stories spoke about, but whom Zayl had never actually met in life. General Torion had flowing brown hair brushed back over his shoulders and trim beard with a hint of gray in it. His aquiline face sported a small scar below his left eye, one of a brilliant blue pair. He stood a head taller than Zayl, and was likely a third again as broad in the shoulders. He was not a giant like Polth, but the cat-like ease in which the veteran officer moved made Zayl suspect that the bodyguard would have been on the losing end of any battle between the two. The Nesardo's visitor was clad in a red uniform with a golden breastplate. In the nook of his left arm, he carried a plumed, open-faced helmet, high boots, a sheathed sword with a rounded guard made up the rest of his ensemble.
Torian!
declared Salene, recovering.
To what do we owe this honor?
The commander had first smiled upon seeing her, but now his aspect turned much darker.
You heard the bells. The old man actually passed away last night, but we spent all this time preparing. Justinian's going to need the support of the majority of the nobility from the outset, and all agreed that your word from him would go a long way toward getting that. We don't want a repeat of the Cardulus insurrection.
What happened then? Zayl asked. For the first time, Torian, like the necromancer, he seemed to have no other name, appeared to register the black-cloaked figure. The general started to draw his sword.
By the church! What is this dog doing here? Selene, has he taken control of your mind?
Sardak immediately stepped out of any possible path that the man might take in charging Zayl. Selene, on the other hand, stepped directly between the officer and his intended target.
Torian! You forget yourself, General!
His reaction was immediate. He released the sword and grimaced as if slapped in the face. The Rathmanian had no trouble understanding why. Torian was deeply in love with Selene.
Selene,
began the soldier.
do you know what this thing is? Do you know what depravities he commits in the graveyard and tombs of...
Torian!
He quieted but continued to glare daggers at the necromancer. The Rathmanian's hostess indicated him and said,
This is Zayl. He is here at my behest. I think you know why.
That trouble with Lord Jin? Selene, if you would just grant me the honor, I've asked more than once.
14 times by my count, offered Sardak. For a brief moment, the general's anger focused on the brother instead of Zayl. Then,
As I was saying, if you would just grant me that, this would no longer trouble you.
Torian, Nesardo is my family legacy.
she said no more, clearly having explained her feelings often enough. Eyes again on the necromancer, Torian abruptly snarled.
If any evil befalls her, I can trace it to you, dog. I'll have your head.
In response, Zayl only nodded. Before the encounter could become violent again, the noblewoman said,
Give the council my word of my support of Justinian. I believe him to be good for Westmarch. He lacks confidence mostly, Torian, and I think you can help him there.
It's good of you to say so.
He clutched tight the helmet, his face showing a different concern.
Selene, come to me if you need any help. And be wary around this grave robber.
Torian.
Recalling himself, the general clicked his heels, bowing to her at the same time. He gave Sardak a cursory nod and utterly ignored Zayl as he departed. That man has a taste for the dramatic entrance, Selene's brother concluded with some mirth. I swear, he timed it as so just to arrive just after the stroke of the bell. I wonder if he had to wait outside for a while beforehand.
Torian is a good man, Sardak.
I doubt our friend here would think so. He made a fair imitation of the officer's grand bow. I think I've overstayed my own welcome. If you need me, sister dear, you know where to find me. Selene did not look pleased.
Yes, the hangman's noose. With that rabble. Be back before the time Zayl told us. If you're not coming with us to the crypt, I'd at least like you near.
Have I ever failed you before? The noblewoman kept her expression constant.
I'll refrain from answering that.
With another chuckle, Sardak moved closer and kissed his sibling on the cheek. With a mocking nod to Zayl, he left the pair alone.
I'm so sorry about the both of them.
Selene shook her head.
If you'd rather forget tonight and leave Westmarch, I'd understand perfectly.
I will be staying. She brightened.
Thank you.
It is not merely because of your request, he told her bluntly. There are matters that I myself am curious about.
Of course. I should have remembered that those of your calling are not normally found this far west in the first place, unless it's on some important matter.
No, we are not. Zayl found himself wishing that such was not the case. It would have been good if he could have found another of Rothma's servants. He would have liked to have conferred with someone else fluent in such matters in order to assure himself that he had not missed anything. But it was too late to concern himself about that. The hour was fast approaching, and he had much more to do.
Can I be of any more help to you, Zayl?
There was one way, but he had been loath to ask. It was the first thing that might make her begin to regret having asked a necromancer for aid. Yet it had to be done. If I may be so bold, I will need some of your blood, my lady.